The laughter. The sterile antiseptic smell of the hospital room was a stark contrast to the raw, gut-wrenching pain that had just hollowed me out. My arms felt achingly empty, the ghost weight of my newborn son, Leo, still a fresh, searing memory. The doctors had been kind, their voices hushed and apologetic. There was nothing we could do, they said. A severe undetected birth defect. He didn't suffer. Their words were meant to be a balm, but they were just noise. The door to my private room creaked open. I didn't have to turn my head. I knew the click of my mother's expensive heels and the heavy, cologne-laden presence of my father. Elias. My mother's voice cut through the silence, devoid of its usual social grace. It was sharp, clinical. The doctor spoke with us. I couldn't form words. My throat was sealed shut with grief. I just stared at the blank, white wall, hoping they would see my devastation and leave. My father sighed, a sound of profound irritation, not sorrow. Well, this is a mess. The paperwork alone. And then it came. A sound so alien, so violently out of place in that room of death, that my brain refused to process it at first. A low chuckle. It was my mother. I slowly turned my head on the pillow. She was looking at her reflection in the dark window, patting her perfectly coiffed silver hair. A smirk played on her lips. Finally, she said, her voice a venomous purr. One less useless mistake breathing out air. Really, Elias? Getting that dull little waitress pregnant? We thought you'd have more sense. My father joined in, a dry, rasping laugh. Took care of itself, I suppose. Saved us the trouble and expense of dealing with your bastard. Cleaner this way. They stood there, two monuments of utter narcissism, laughing in the face of my dead child. Their grandson. In that moment, the paralyzing grief didn't vanish. It was incinerated. In its place, a cold, diamond-hard certainty formed. They had just signed their own ruin. The awakening. I was discharged into a world that had lost its color. But I wasn't the same man who had entered that hospital. The old Elias, the privileged, somewhat aimless son who had rebelled against his cold parents by being deliberately mediocre, was buried with Leo. The man who walked out was a ghost with a purpose. My parents, Alistair and Eleanor Vance, were pillars of old money and new cruelty. Their fortune was built on a foundation of pharmaceuticals, public philanthropy, and private exploitation. They valued their reputation, their social standing, and their control above all else. They had laughed at my son's death. They would not laugh again. The plan. I retreated not to my own apartment, but to the small sun-drenched cottage Leo's mother, Clara, had lived in. She had passed away in a car accident just a month before his birth. Another tragedy my parents had called convenient. This place was the antithesis of my parents' cold marble mansion. It was filled with her art, her warmth, the memory of a love they had deemed a useless mistake. My revenge would not be violent. It would not be a crime of passion. It would be a surgical strike. It would be systemic. I would take everything they loved and destroy it from the inside out, using their own weapons. Money, information, and reputation. Phase 1, the prodigal son. I went to them, humbled. I wore a suit. I spoke in a quiet, broken voice. You were right, I said, staring at the floor of my father's study. About everything. It was a mistake. I see that now. I need structure. Purpose. I want to come into the business. I want to learn. They ate it up. My father's chest puffed with victory. His rebellious son, finally broken into submission. My mother's smile was one of pure triumph. They saw my grief not as pain, but as a desirable weakness they had finally exploited. They gave me a junior executive position at Vance Pharmaceuticals, a hollow title with no real power, a placebo to keep me quiet. Phase 2, the apprentice. I became the most diligent, unassuming employee. I worked late. I asked questions. I was eager to please. I gained access. I used my family name to befriend key personnel, disgruntled lab techs, overworked accountants, secretaries who saw everything. I learned where the bodies were buried, both figurative and literal. I discovered the illegal trials of a new anxiety drug in countries with lax regulations. The hush money payments to families of patients who had suffered severe side effects. The environmental shortcuts at a manufacturing plant that was poisoning a local town's water supply. The offshore accounts where millions were stashed, evading taxes. My father's personal favorite, the charitable foundation that was a thinly veiled slush fund for their extravagant lifestyle. For 2 years, I documented everything. I built a digital fortress of evidence, emails, financial records, internal memos, secret recordings of my father gloating about his clever schemes. I became an expert in their corruption. The execution. The day of the Vance Foundation's annual Winter Gala arrived. It was the social event of the season. My parents would be at their most visible, surrounded by the press, politicians, and high society they so desperately craved to impress. It was the perfect stage. I dressed in the tuxedo they had bought for me. I looked the part of the dutiful heir. The grand ballroom was a glittering spectacle of wealth and hypocrisy. My mother held court, dripping in diamonds, laughing her brittle social laugh. My father clapped backs and made deals disguised as pleasantries. I moved through the crowd, a ghost at the feast. I nodded, I smiled, I played my part. Then, I found the head of the AV team, a man my father chronically underpaid and belittled. A discreet envelope of cash and a USB drive changed hands. At the height of the evening, as my father took the microphone to give his self-congratulatory speech about the family's commitment to ethics and community, the giant screens behind him flickered. His smiling face was replaced with a spreadsheet of the offshore accounts. The crowd murmured in confusion. "What is this?" he barked, turning around. His face paled. The screen changed again, to a memo detailing the cover-up of the poisoned water supply. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. News cameras, there to cover the charity event, swung toward the screens, their red lights now blinking with frantic intensity. It was a synchronized avalanche. As chaos erupted in the ballroom, every major news outlet, financial regulator, and federal agency received an anonymous, encrypted data packet. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and perfectly curated. I walked to the bar, ordered a whiskey, and watched. I watched as my father's face turned from confusion to rage, then to sheer, unadulterated terror as reporters shoved microphones in his face, shouting questions about fraud and manslaughter. I watched my mother's perfect composure shatter. Her smile vanished, replaced by a rictus of panic as her social circle backed away from her as if she were contagious. The diamonds on her neck seemed to glow not with wealth, but with indictment. Their laughter was gone. All that was left was the silent, screaming horror of their impending fall. The reckoning. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Vance Pharmaceuticals collapsed within weeks. The stock plummeted. Assets were seized. My parents were arrested at dawn in a perp walk that was splashed across every front page. The narrative wasn't just about financial crime. It was about grotesque human betrayal. I made sure the story of why I did it, the laughing at their dead grandchild, was leaked. They weren't just criminals, they were monsters. They lost everything. Their money, their reputation, their powerful friends. They were left with only each other and a bottomless well of mutual hatred and blame. I, however, had protected myself. My role as the whistleblower, the grieving son seeking justice for his child, was airtight. I was hailed as a hero, a man of conscience. The fortune I inherited, what was left of it after fines and settlements, I used to set up a legitimate foundation in Leo's name, funding pediatric healthcare and support for grieving parents. The final visit. Months later, I visited them. Not in their mansion, but in a cramped, bleak interview room of the Federal Detention Center. They looked small, old. The expensive clothes were replaced with shapeless jumpsuits. The power and arrogance had been leached out of them. My mother looked at me with pure, undiluted hatred. "You," she spat. "Me," I said calmly, sitting down. "You destroyed us. Your own family," my father croaked, his voice stripped of its authority. "You laughed," I said, my voice quiet and steady, filling the small room. "You looked at me, holding the memory of my dead son, and you laughed. You called him a useless mistake." My mother's eyes glinted with a final futile attempt at cruelty. "He was." I smiled then. It was a cold, peaceful smile that never reached my eyes. "I know," I said. "And so were you. You were a mistake in my life. A cancerous, toxic mistake. And I have finally excised you." I stood up to leave. I had said all I needed to say. "Wait!" my father cried out, the sound desperate and broken. "You can't leave us here. We're your parents." I paused at the door and looked back at the two broken people who had given me life and had tried so hard to make it worthless. "No," I said, my final words to them landing with the weight of a tombstone. I'm Leo's father. You are nothing to me. I walked out into the sunlight, leaving them in the cold, gray silence. There was no laughter anymore. Only the quiet, enduring sound of a debt finally paid in full.